everyone, Hafsa here, and today I'll start teaching you how to become an independent animator, beginning with the most basic part of how to actually start a project. So, I've been working as an independent animator for the last couple of years, making complete works from start to finish, both for my clients and for my personal and promotional use. If you are here on this course, there's a good chance that you have seen my work on social media, and I really thank you for liking it enough to come here, by the way, and that it is somewhat popular, but my animations are actually not all that special. It is, after all, my job to create nice-looking art, and there are many people who are doing the same type of thing. But what really sets my animations and my work apart, and what brought me my success, was the amount of work that I'm able to produce in a short amount of time. As we are going to learn, 2D animation is a complicated and time-consuming art form, which takes immense amount of work and is usually done in teams. But I still consistently create new, complete animations every week, each unique and with its own story. So the question I get asked the most about my art is actually how do I do it? Where do I get the inspiration? And how don't I have burnouts? And in today's lessons, I'm going to focus on that exactly and teach you about my process and how I consistently create art without burnout. I use the same type of process for both my personal work and my professional work in cases where the only thing my client has is a vague idea of what they want. Because this is basically how you figure out a new project and how you start it. Let's talk about inspiration, motivation, and consistent work. The key part to creation is usually said to be inspiration or expression. I actually find this to not be true, because when you're relying on inspiration to hit to start a new project, you can't consistently create. You always have to wait for it. It can definitely help, and the greatest work have inspiration as their basis, but it's unsustainable and usually fleeting. Even if you plan your project to its finest details, once you are actually faced with the amount of work it requires, your own limitation as an artist that prevent you from making it as you want, or just the amount of time it takes to complete, you will definitely lose your inspiration and through it your motivation, which will lead you to abandoning the project or modifying it to be simpler at the very least. Expression is another word that gets thrown around a lot as a source for creation and a way to find motivation. But this, again, is very limiting. By only making art that has a saying or a meaning behind it, you will definitely run out of things to say or ways to say them. Or they might simply be too vague or personal for you to express them clearly, which can be frustrating and leads to lack of motivation as well. From my experience, the greatest and easiest way to be at a constant creative state is to completely disregard the importance of your work. It doesn't have to come from a random spike of inspiration which you have no control over, and it doesn't have to have a grand idea or saying behind it. Its only purpose is to exist. But now you might be thinking that if you don't use inspiration or expression to start a new project, then how do you start? How do you get an idea? And the answer to that is creating for the sake of the process itself. Not the product at the end, but the skill you acquire by making it. In fact, I almost feel no connection to my work whatsoever. It's simply the byproduct of the skills that I've tried learning by making it. This is why the question you need to ask yourself when you're starting a new project is not something like what I'm going to draw, but more like what do I want to practice? Animation is a very long process with many steps in it, so your practice can be about anything basically. You can try to work with certain poses, testing camera angles, trying to work on your background or character designs. You can tidy your storyboards, making better cleanup, testing different animation techniques, experimenting with compositing and lighting, focusing on your storytelling, or simply animating a subject that you haven't done before. Even something as small as testing a new feature or brush setting is enough to start a new project. And my secret to continuously coming up with new ideas is just to combine multiple things that I want to practice together and find a way to connect them into a coherent thing. When you make art, you can always get better. There's always something you haven't tried, a new feature you haven't tested, a part of the process you haven't practiced quite as much. You always have to search for the things that you haven't done, and the more you practice, the more ideas you'll have for new practice. The more holes in your knowledge you will find, and the better your practice itself will become. Of course, looking at other people's works and the world around you can give you ideas to things that you want to try, and you will inevitably use them because you are looking at other things at all times. But when you are looking and searching for inspiration or things to test and practice, try and really think about the way that they work. How do things move? Why are they designed the way they are? What makes something looks good or aesthetically pleasing? And after asking yourself these questions, try and test the things yourself and find the answer. This will both give you ideas to practice, as well as improve the overall quality of your art. This is how you can improve your practice itself as well, instead of just repeating the same types of ideas and mistakes and staying in your comfort zone. When choosing my practice subject, I always start from the bottom and go up. So first, what software features do I want to use? What animation techniques do I want to work on? What action can express these techniques well? What design will have the right properties to express these techniques? And what environment will look good with this design? What color palettes work with this combination of character and background? And what effects and compositing I want to try? And then finally, what story ties all of this together? By going through these questions and similar variants with the thought of what I want to practice instead of what will look good and give me a good product, I focus on the process and not the results of it, which takes away a lot of the stress which relates to creating. Because now, if something takes a long time to complete, I just know that it's because it's something that I'm unfamiliar with. And if some part of the drawing is not perfect, it's because it's not what I focused on. It just wasn't a priority, so it doesn't really matter. I tried practicing something else. And I will practice it next time, so there's no worry if it's not perfect right now. You just have to set clear goals for yourself and try to stick to them as much as possible. And the final and complete product will come from you working on each individual part of it and practicing it to make it look better. The great thing about making your creative choices based on practice is that the more you create with this mindset, the better you become. For example, you might not practice line quality in one specific project, but it will still look good because you've worked on line quality in the previous one. You might not be focusing on backgrounds for the specific project you're working on, but they're still going to look good and take you a short amount of time to make because you've already practiced backgrounds before. And even if your backgrounds or line quality or any other part of your production is not up to the quality that you want it to be, you simply have to practice it again in the next project. Don't try and fret about making it perfect for each and every project that you make. A lot of the time, focusing on quantity and specific parts of the process is going to be better than focusing on quality, because at the end you will still practice more and you will feel more productive with your results. It's just important to take note on where you made mistakes and where you didn't focus enough, and just use this reference for your next project so you know which parts need more work. Of course, this will give you ideas as well. And also, a great thing about using practice as your basis for ideas is that you can always practice the same thing twice. I myself often practice the same things in different combinations, which helps me create new and unique ideas each time, and lets me avoid the perfectionist approach, and most importantly of all, helps me get better very quickly. With this way of thinking, you will also improve a lot and at leaps and bounds instead of just steady progress, because you will always try and improve multiple things at once, even if it doesn't feel like it, because you're only making a single project. Now, the exercise for this part of the lesson is to actually test and think about your own capabilities. Try and sketch a bunch of simple shapes and try and draw them as 3D as you can to see if you have the ability to draw different objects from different angles. See how quickly you can make them. Next, try and create simple sketches of different environments, again from different angles and different subjects. They don't need to be perfect, but it's better to try and make them without any grids, and still make the perspective correct. Again, see how quickly you can make them, and how clear they are without any erasing or corrections. For a base background or composition, it shouldn't take you more than 2 minutes to make. It's just very simple shapes and objects without many details. The important thing to focus on is the perspective at this point. Try and create at least 3 sketches with both natural and man-made objects. And also try and include some difficult angles that you don't usually use. The next thing to test is your consistency with characters. Draw a very simple character in a neutral position. Don't add any details, just make them like a mannequin. And now, try and draw them in the exact same position, a little bit to the side. Don't use another layer or a reference. Just try and see if you can consistently keep the proportions of the different body parts of your character, even without any rules or supporting guides. And in the next stage, try and create different poses with your characters while still keeping the same proportions. The next thing to test is the actual amount of time that it takes you to add details to your characters. So take the same poses that you've done before and add the details. And then try and draw your character from scratch with details included. The last test is about your actual line quality. See how many sketchy lines you're adding to your sketches and main designs, and try and capture the same poses and same designs and same perspectives using a single line instead of any other cross-hatching or repeating lines that you might have used for this first exercise. As an animator, the ideal way to create your rough sketches is to only use one line while keeping your drawing as consistent and understandable as possible. Try and see if you can control the thickness of your line with a pressure pen and test how wobbly it is without any stabilizers. You can try and test it by going over your characters or background drawings from before and seeing how well it looks with a single clean line. By making all of these exercises and measuring how much time it took you to complete each one of them, it can give you a good measure as to how much time you're going to spend on creating a single animation. Because you will have to both draw your characters multiple times from multiple different angles, keep your designs consistent, and make your own backgrounds. And for every one of them, you need to make sure that your lines are in good quality. So this was basically a small preview of what you're going to make for each individual frame of your project. Now remember that in animation, you're going to draw a minimum of 8 frames for a single second. So try and estimate how much time you're going to put into each individual second based on how much time it took you to create your sketches and your cleanups right now. And based on this, create your exercises and your subject of your animation for the rest of the course. You need to make sure that you're not going to overwork yourself throughout it and give up in the middle of the way. Even though now we know that the things we want to practice will lead us to our final product, we still need to know how to connect these ideas of what we want to practice and what to do when working with clients where experimenting and using unfamiliar concepts is kind of a bad work model because you want to try and make the things that you're familiar with in order to save time and make sure that your product quality is high. The key to help us understand how and when we're choosing our techniques is understanding the purpose of the animation and your own limitation as an artist. First, you need to figure out what is the actual amount of work you can handle at the moment of creating your project. The ability to work is not a given and it's not a gift or a talent as well. The ability to work takes practice, and just as with everything else, you need to build it from the ground up. You can't expect yourself to be able to sit down and draw for 12 hours a day straight from the beginning, the same way that you wouldn't expect yourself to run a marathon without training. And just as you can't be in top physical condition at all times, you can't work full force at all times. You have to know and understand your own limitations at any given moment and adjust your workload accordingly. But just as complete lack of physical activity will lead to your body weakening, completely abandoning your work ethics will lead to a decrease in productivity and might lead into more burnout and lack of motivation. You need to create at least a little bit to maintain your creative condition. Managing and understanding the amount of rest and intense work that you can handle is a pretty lengthy process that takes time and some self-reflection about your own abilities. But by understanding it, you will be able to consistently produce your content without any burnout and plan both your personal and work projects. If you know what your condition is and how much time and effort you're willing to dedicate to your project, you can set yourself reasonable and achievable goals, while still being kind to yourself and feeling less guilty about the amount of work that you're actually producing. If you know that your mental or physical condition is not at its top performance, You shouldn't feel guilty when not creating consistently. And by really understanding yourself, you'll be able to predict your own condition depending on many variants and plan your workload accordingly. For example, I actually make most of the works that you see on my social media weeks in advance before I post them. And I have a pretty large stack of works to fall on at all times, as well as multiple ongoing projects which I can work on at different times, because I know that my availability depends on my clients and on my all natural condition. So I make sure that whenever my condition is good, I make a lot of works so I can rest and pace myself when needed, and when I feel like I ran out of ideas or energy to practice. And by removing the perfectionist approach and the stress associated with it, by placing the importance on practice instead of the product, and by understanding my own personal capabilities and my condition, I can avoid putting stress on myself and create a good environment that lets me be constantly productive. Basically, the secret is to just treat yourself well. Don't stress yourself out by trying to be perfect, and don't try and overwork yourself. That being said though, I've been steadily increasing my workload for years now, so my initial production rate is pretty high as well. If you're aiming to become a professional which works multiple hours a day, or in general want to increase your productivity, you need to be able to pace yourself and be patient while increasing your workload. Otherwise, same as with physical training, you will just hurt yourself and go back to square one. After figuring out how much work you can handle, you need to understand your project purpose and goal. So you'll be able to focus yourself on what things you want to practice and limit yourself to make sure that your project size is fitting to your level and to the amount of effort that you're willing to put into it. Working for a client is quite easy, because the goal is to complete the client's job to their liking, meaning that it will have limitations such as length, subjects, and deadlines, which will force you to work with your existing knowledge. But when creating for yourself or for your viewers, it's harder to decide on which things to focus on and how to hold yourself back, because there are many possibilities for practice and the tendency to be perfect is strong and will make it hard to keep motivated throughout the project. To figure this out, you need to ask yourself 3 things. First, where is your art going to be viewed and by whom? Second, what do you want to accomplish with your art? And third, how much work you're willing to put into it. The way you'll present your art on social media is different to how you'll present it in your professional portfolio, and both of them will be different from art that you're only making for yourself. Your professionalism, type of content, and even formatting needs to take into account the platform where you're going to post it, and the type of audience seeing it. For example, different social media sites have different limitations on their file size, video length, or canvas proportions, each one affecting the way that you're going to plan your project, because a short animation that works well with one site might need to be cropped or duplicated to fit another. And on professional portfolio sites, you will need work in the best quality you can get, making your canvas size bigger and your videos shorter to compensate for the file size. And in the same way that your platform gives you limitation, your audience will give you limitations as well. On social media, you want something that immediately draws the eye in the feed, and videos that everyone can relate to and like. While on professional portfolios, you want to make something very high quality, that will be appreciated by other professionals or possible clients. By understanding what is the purpose of your project, you can change your approach to it, and it can help you focus on what things you want and need to practice, which in turn gives you your ideas. The limitations presented by both media, audience, and purpose will determine the amount of work that you're willing to put into your project. With a long process such as animation, you will need to have momentum to pull through it all the way to completion. By knowing in advance how much work your project is going to take, how much effort you can put into it, you will be able to decide all the goals for your projects, which can help you push through and finish it. Basically, the most important thing when creating your own project is to complete them. Even if the product is not perfect, just by completing it, you're making great steps into improving your art and your productivity. You can have many starting points for your project depending on what you want to practice. It can be character design, background, movement, angle. But how do you actually build on those? After all, you might not know everything you want to put into your animation straight from the beginning. So you would have to go along with your project and add details to it after you're already started. Not having everything planned out straight from the beginning might even be a good thing, because you don't let the amount of practice topics and the quality of your practice distract you from actually completing your project. Choosing just one thing to practice and building everything else from there is a completely valid way to start your project. Once you do have your starting point, there are two main approaches that I found that work very well when planning your project. Each one of them has their own slightly different order of doing things, and I call them the dynamic motion and the moving illustration starting points. The dynamic action approach is for when the focus of your animation or practice is the technical movement itself. With this approach, I'll first create a rough animatic focusing entirely on the motion that I want to practice. Acting, fighting, action, dynamic camera, effects, and abstract object. All of these require putting the animation first and the atmosphere and background and lighting second. In these cases, I'll start by almost animating the entire storyboard of the scenes that I want, using many very rough sketches to get a good understanding of the actions that I have in mind and what timing I want to give the animation. And once I have my main action scene, I add additional supporting scenes to create a narrative around it. Again, each one of these supporting scenes will be about practicing different things such as camera angle, composition, background design, character design, or anything else. The idea is to have one main scene and technique that you want to practice, and then giving it some context. Because with this approach, we basically focus more on the movement instead of the actual design parts of the animation, we have a lot of freedom to choose our design to fit the animation itself. So you can adjust it both to the difficulty level and the actual amount of effort that you want to put into your project. A lot of the time, in my projects, I actually don't give a lot of focus on the backgrounds and compositing of the animation if it's more motion focused. You see that a lot in my more simplified animations, which tend to have more dynamic movement. Basically, with the dynamic motion approach, you first create the animation and then match the aesthetics to it. So you will be choosing color palette, character designs, and sometimes background if they are necessary. The moving illustration approach, on the other hand, is for when the focus of the animation is actually the design and aesthetics of it. With this approach, we'll start by creating a rough sketch, either colored or not, that gives us an idea about what types of shots we want to create. In this approach, we basically start by actually planning the final look, or at least have the beginning of the final look, of a certain shot in the animation. You can even use it for multiple shots if you have a narrative or a story in mind which connects them already. The moving illustration approach has starting points with character design, background design, color palette, art style, atmosphere, and compositing practice. Basically, any other thing aside from the motion can be covered by this approach. Basically, if you have an idea of what type of thing you want to practice, you just test your idea using a rough color frame. And then you just create the additional scenes that support the narrative and give context to the single shot that you have in mind. And once you have the rough concept of your shot or scene, you then match the movement to it. You need to think about what kind of motion will work well with the design and style of your animation. What motion will make the entire thing look interesting, or will create and support the story or narrative? What kind of motion can support your character design details in the best way? Or you can go at it from the other direction. How does the compositing and character design restrict you when you try to design your motion? To recap, today we've learned about starting a new project and finding a reliable source for motivation and ideas, as well as how to pace yourself to avoid burnout, and how to choose the right place to start based on the purpose of your scene. We've also completed a couple of exercises to test your abilities, so it will be easier for you to know how to adjust the course to your own level. Next time, we're going to review the 12 classical principles of animations and when and how we're going to encounter them throughout the course. Thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye!